I'm Eric Trommater.
And I'm Erin Brown.
And this is World Cinema History.
Yes. And how he kissed me under the Moorish walls. And I thought, well, him is another. And then I asked him with my eyes to ask me again, yes. And then he asked me, would I? Yes. To say yes, my mountain flower. And first, I put my arms around him, and I drew him down so he could feel my breasts all perfumed. Yes. And I could feel his heart going like mad. And yes, I said, yes, I will. Yes.
Erin, go brah.
Brah.
Funnier every time I hear it.
Yep.
What you just heard was a recording of Sharon Nealon doing Molly Bloom's soliloquy from the annual Bloom Stage Festival. Because this week, Erin and I are diving into James Joyce on film. Two adaptations of James Joyce's Ulysses. A 1967 film, co-written and directed by Joseph Strict and starring Milo O'Shea, and a 2003 adaptation called Bloom, directed by Sean Walsh and featuring Stephen Rae. If you were asked what your idea of what the plot of James Joyce's Ulysses was,
from what I understand, it's what's happening between some Irish people over the course of one day, and it's paralleling the Odyssey. And that's as much as I know.
You're not wrong. And you're less wrong than author Salman Rushdie of Satanic Verses fame. This was what his idea of the plot of Ulysses was.
Middle-aged, cuckolded Jewish advertising salesman walks around Dublin for the day, leches after club-footed girl at beach, goes to red light district, gets even more drunk, meets young guy, brings him home in the middle of the night, maybe tries to pimp out his wife to young guy. The end.
Yeah.
He got it completely wrong. So, for instance, Leopold Bloom is not drunk. Of the 20 hours that are logged in Ulysses, we see him drink one glass of Burgundy the entire time. So it's not even interpretable. I hope that makes you feel slightly better.
Yeah, a little bit.
Ulysses is a novel that is sometimes criticized for having too slim a plot line. But to me, if you define plot as, hey, what's going to happen? No, nobody robs a bank, nobody gets shot, nobody gets killed. It doesn't have that kind of a plot. But if you are talking about actual dramatic tension, Ulysses absolutely grips me. You mentioned the paralleling of Homer's Odyssey. James Joyce wasn't actually using the Odyssey as his structural, I hate to use the word gimmick, but the handle that he was using to put on this material. He was using a children's version of the Odyssey written by Charles Lamb, the same fellow who was nice enough to remove all of the poetry from Shakespeare. Ezra Pound put that structure into perspective. He called it a scaffold of means of construction justified by the result, and justifiable by it only. The result is a triumph in form, balance, a main schema with continuous weaving and arabesque. And what he's pointing at is that every moment of Ulysses points to another moment. And if that's not your definition of plot, perhaps you would find it rather slight, because you begin with the Telemachus character, who's Stephen Dedalus, hang out with him for 3 chapters, you hang out with Leopold Bloom for another 3 chapters. You have a couple of near misses between the two until the two finally meet, and then they return home to find out that his wife had committed infidelity, and all of the furniture in his house seems to be rearranged, and he's sleeping in the wet spot of the man who just had sex with his wife. That is the plot of Ulysses. There is a tension all the way through, because during this 20 hours where you have almost every thought through stream of consciousness in Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom's head, at any moment, Leopold could just decide to walk home and disturb the tryst that his wife is having with a guy by the name of Blazes Bolin, who is there presumably because he and Bloom's wife are going to do a musical tour together. You are also missing the ambiance and the atmosphere provided by James Joyce's sheer use of the Irish accented language, the English language in the Irish form. But what you're also missing is the tension of the everyday struggle, because Leopold Bloom comes to represent an everyman in a way, and yet he's a no man because he is technically someone who is considered a Jew in Ireland. That provides tension throughout all 18 chapters of the book. When someone says, "Well, you know, it's a 250,000 words built on too thin a plot," their definition of plot isn't adequate to what James Joyce has created. How far would you say you ever got into the book, if I can be so bold to ask, Erin?
Not very. Maybe halfway through the first chapter. Like you were saying about the Irish vernacular, that was hard to follow for me because I'm not from Ireland. I'm not from that time period, and it was just the way they were talking was not a way that I could track. And I think that was the biggest issue for me. Not that there was anything bad about the novel, just that I couldn't follow what was happening because I didn't follow the dialect he was writing in.
Again, that's a legitimate. I, on the other hand, read it the same way I read poetry. I didn't have to understand every word as in being able to sit and give a definition of it, but I had to be able to figure it out in context.
It seemed to me that I had been transported into a country far away from this country, into an age remote from this age, that I stood in ancient Egypt, and that I was listening to the speech of a high priest of that land, addressed to the youthful Moses. His listeners held their cigarettes poised to the earth, their smoke ascending in frail stalks that flowered with his speech. Noble words coming. Look out.
There is a rhythm and a poetry that goes with it, and James Joyce, who was also an accomplished musician and an accomplished singer, is all about rhythm. Erin, I'm going to give it to you. He is a wordy motherfucker.
Yes, he is.
He has a talent to take something that, why use 1,000 words when 250,000 will do? It seems to be his motto. And
it's like the opposite of Hemingway. There's no economy of words with James Joyce.
Or his student Samuel Beckett, who was Joyce's assistant. But of the two movies, I think the first film really kind of plays into what your problems with reading the novel were and heightens them, which makes it a great film if you've already read the novel. And the second film does the harder task, the 2003 Bloom does the harder task of taking a somewhat inaccessible novel and making it much, much more accessible. So, for instance, the Irish accents are flattened out quite a bit, not dealing with a lot of deep droves. I, for instance, who have read the novel at least every 3 years since 1988 was the first time that I read it. And at least every 3 years I reread the novel. Still sometimes while I was watching the Joseph Strick 1967 version, would flip the subtitles on to remind myself what section, what section. And I have committed large amounts of this to memory. You will not have that problem with the 2003 version. And I have a lot of respect for that. Erin, like yourself, I'm a sucker for those. We used to get them on Masterpiece Theater and Mystery over here in the United States, with those sort of BBC produced, real slick productions that they used to do. Jeremy Brett as Sherlock Holmes, or Mystery used to have, they do the Agatha Christie. My favorite was the Hugh Poirot with David Suchet, and the 2003 version is definitely in that vein. It is just a very tightly, very slickly produced. You're not going to sit there and think a lot. It is not covering the material in a way that a diehard James Joyce lover like myself would want to be seen, but it is just an accessible and entertaining movie. The other thing that I recommend about it is period appropriate. Whereas to watch the 1967 version, you have to think the same way you would if you see a modern day dress version of a Shakespeare play. It is actually set in as if it was 1967, so you have motor cars and things like that, and it is set as if everything was taking place in what was then the modern day, when, as most people know, this takes place on June 16th, 1904, which we Joyceans celebrate as Bloom's Day. And I know most people know this, but I'm going to repeat it anyway for the 6 or 7 people who accidentally stumbled on this who don't. But that was because that was the day that James Joyce met his lifelong love, Nora Barnacle, and that's why he chose that day. And the 20 hours out of this day being spent in 1967, the 63 years that elapsed between 1904 and 1967 were huge ones. You have World War I, you have the Irish Independence War, you have the rise of the IRA, you have World War II. There's a huge Jewish theme throughout this because Leopold Bloom's father is Jewish, and the reason why he is considered an outsider is because the rest of Ireland considers him Jewish. The Holocaust can't be mentioned because, of course, it wasn't in the original novel written in 1922 and taking place in 1904, and yet you're in 1967. Whereas the 2003 version with Stephen Rae, number one, Stephen Rae has a nice big mustache, which Milo O'Shea in the 67 version has no mustache. He's not Bloom the way I pictured him when I read it. He's not Bloom the way that he looks with the little bowler cap and the mustache on the cover of the novel. And so physically you're taken out of it. And also, because he's riding in a motor car instead of in a horse and carriage, you're taken out of it mentally as well. But there are some benefits. I just want to point out that I'm going to say some negative things about the 1967 version, but I do think that both versions are definitely worth watching.
The topic is reminding me of this, but Oh Brother, Where Art Thou was allegedly a 1930s era retelling of the Odyssey. And I thought that was a great film. That was a lot of fun. It wasn't, one for one the Odyssey, but I think it worked really well. And it's the Coen brothers.
Well, the Coen brothers never read the Odyssey. So it was based on their... It would be like Salman Rushdie doing his version of Ulysses based on his recollections.
I mean, it did have a lot of the elements there, but yeah, you can. It's not very much not one for one.
No, but it is an example. But normally I don't think that works because I don't think anachronism in itself is telling. You can't just one for one say, oh, well, this is still modern to me because somebody is delivering a Shakespeare soliloquy from the back of a truck, I think there needs to be a little bit more thought than that put into it. If you're going to update those things, I think you need to update them politically as well. And so there is a very famous scene where someone called the Citizen begins attacking Leo Bloom for his supposed Jewishness. And we're going to play two versions of it. The first is the 1967 version, and this is the Milo O'Shea.
Mendelssohn was a Jew, and Karl Marx, and Mercadante, and Spinoza. And the Savior was a Jew, and his father was a Jew, your God.
He had no father, that'll do, I'm driving on.
Who's God? Well, his uncle was a Jew, your God was a Jew, and Christ was a Jew like me.
And this is going to be Stephen Rae in the 2003 version, and doing the exact same scene.
3 cheers for Israel! Mendelssohn was a Jew. And Karl Marx. And Mercadante and Spinoza. And the Saviour was a Jew. And his father was a Jew. Your God!
He had no father. Drive ahead!
Well, his uncle was a Jew. Your God was a Jew. Christ was a Jew. Like me!
Jesus. I'll batter him for calling his name in vain.
Karl Marx was a Jew. Your Savior was a Jew. Your God is a Jew. Well, if not your God, then your God's uncle was a Jew. You know, and to me, in the 1967 version, that seems like anti-Semitism, like almost what we would in modern days call virtue signal. Whereas in the 2003 version, because it's set in its proper time, we are actually witnessing what makes Bloom the outsider to this society, which is not just that his father was Jewish, but that he has these attitudes toward people that he just thinks that they should all love each other, which, you know, quite honestly, in 1904, a little bit bizarre. Today, you know, somebody like that probably going to be an outcast in the Dublin pub scene. He has set himself up for failure. And I also would like to point out the difference in the performances there, because you hear Milo O'Shea, who is a very good actor, you know, he's especially in the theater, but I think as directed by Strick, he is giving a over-the-top comic performance. So this is an actor performing as Bloom, whereas I really think that Stephen Rae is just Bloom. He is just playing Bloom as a character. The fact that the scene is done in a comic way is irrelevant to how he gives his performance, and that again is why I think of the two, it is definitely better to watch. But there is a section of both films where I think the 67 version really fails, and the 2003 version, by kind of gliding over it and just not falling into the same pitfalls, succeeds. And that is what's called the Cersei section, where Bloom follows Stephen to the red light district and goes to a house of prostitution. And in the novel, this is the longest section. It's about 150 pages of the novel. But a lot of that is because it is written as a play. And so you have a lot of wasted space. And this play, it was very, very influential on future writers, especially in theater, including the aforementioned Samuel Beckett, who was at one point a student of James Joyce. And in the 1967 version, Joseph Strick really goes to town on the idea that Beckett was influenced by this Cersei section to create the theater of the absurd. But Beckett, as well as being a student of Joyce, was a student of Wittgenstein. And so Beckett came at all of his comedy with a hostility of language. Whereas, as we've pointed out, James Joyce had no hostility towards language whatsoever. And unfortunately, what this makes for is a very long section of this film that is very, very dated today, because it is constantly harping back to these almost skits in this Beckett format. And it's also makes it rather undistinguished, because is this the Goon Show? Is this a Richard Lester Beatles film? Is this, an early Monty Python sketch? Because this kind of surrealistic, absurdist comedy where the sketches run too long without that edge of words don't actually mean anything, and the words that are being spoken aren't actually purveying what the author once said, the way Beckett does, say, in Endgame or Waiting for Godot. These just feel like overlong skits. Whereas the 2003 version, Stephen Rae, as a performer, and the director both just treat it as a straightforward telling of the story. And so you have this long hallucination section, which Bloom actually imagines himself being dominated by the madam of the sex worker house, the bordello, transforming into a woman, and the madam being transformed into a man, and so you have this gender switch that takes place, which is something that when we were listening to Salman Rushdie, he had read too much into when he was claiming that that Daedalus was being basically sold to Bloom's wife Molly at the end.
I think comedy changed a lot between the 60s and the early 2000s. So having that theater of the absurd long sketch might have been a lot funnier back then, but playing it straight is always funnier, in my opinion. Because, I mean, if you're mugging at the camera like I'm making a joke, look how funny I am, that stops being funny. But if you're playing it straight like this is something that's happening right now and the absurdity is just accepted, that's freaking hilarious. Does that help?
Well, it's what makes John Cleese sometimes the funniest the member of Monty Python, in a way.
Yeah.
Or
yeah,
or God rest his soul, Graham Chapman was definitely the best actor of the bunch because he could just play it straight.
Yeah.
If you look at like something like The Life of Brian, which is very influenced by Beckett.
Interesting. A great movie.
Well, but you look at the you look at the scene in Life of Brian where he is pretending to preach, and he says, "Consider the lilies in the field," and somebody in the crowd says, "He's going after the flowers now." That's perfect Beckett because you've got that timing, that pitch,
Yeah.
Well, okay. Well, imagine that scene with James Joyce written, where the joke is 6 lines, and then the punchline's another 6, and then you have a response that's another 6, and that unfortunately is what you've got with Joseph Strick, where he is filming it in that manner. So you have the fast cutting, you have the quick flashbacks, you have and this goes, I think, to my experience reading the novel for the first time. Because on my first reading, I never knew this was supposed to be difficult. I was, say, 18 years old, and I was reading it because it was a sequel to one of my favorite books I had read in high school, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and it was the further adventures of Stephen Dedalus, and I was reading it as that. And yeah, there were things that I didn't understand, but I had been raised as what they call a special education or learning disabled kid. And so I had learned that there are always things that I don't understand. And it never actually occurred to me that this book was any more difficult than anything else that I had to do. Because I always had to learn, you become an autodidact that way. And I had always had to learn what things meant from context,
With the whole undiagnosed autism thing going on, I take things very literally. Which is funny because I didn't know that I did that for the longest time until my son was diagnosed, and then I found out we have the same traits. Crap, that's why I'm the way I am. And so it sounds like you don't take things as literally as I do, and you feel like you've been told your whole life that you're not going to understand things, so that when you do, it's just, oh, okay. But for me, I've been told my whole life I'm really smart, and I feel like I should understand stuff, and when I don't, then I feel really bad about it. So I think we're kind of inverted with the way our brains process things in some ways.
But you don't have that problem with, say, Monty Python or, say, a Richard Lester film with absurdist comedy when you know ahead of time that it's comedy.
Yeah, if I know it's going to be comedy, I can get it. And a lot of times what's funny to me is not understanding what I'm seeing, and it's just so incongruous, it makes me laugh. I think that's a big part of it. And I think that that's kind of what they were going for with Monty Python, is let's do something that makes absolutely no sense because it's funny to us. And I feel like that's the kind of humor that I get, you know? I get other things too, but that's, yeah.
And that is the type of humor that James Joyce's Ulysses just absolutely reeks with. Because, and I'm going to play this tape from Stephen Rae, who I think puts it into the best perspective. So hang on for that.
Well, I'll tell you the book I've chosen as my favourite book, and it may make some people's hearts sink because it's a book that is associated with difficulty, whereas in fact it should be associated with joy. It's the novel Ulysses by James Joyce. It is, to me, the most perfectly written book, or perhaps the second most perfectly written book in the English language. It may be that The Great Gatsby is as perfect, word for word, just in terms of English, But Ulysses is deeper and richer and wider and is comic, whereas The Great Gatsby is a tragic novel. And I think all great art is comic art, because comic art is about joining. The last word of Ulysses is yes. In fact, the last three words are yes, yes, yes. It's the most affirmative book. As you may know, it's the retelling of Homer's Odyssey, the great first epic, really, after the Iliad, the greatest story ever told. And it's told in one day, in Dublin on the 16th of June. And instead of Ulysses, this great Greek hero, there's this little Jewish man called Leopold Bloom and his wife Molly. And it's the search for a son he never really had, in the same way that Ulysses searches for his son in the original. It's hard to explain because every chapter has an organ, a colour, a sense. The language is developed to a pitch of modernity that, as I say, some people find difficult. I have no idea what it's like in Dutch. I can't imagine how you would translate it. But if your English is good enough, read it, and you'll be astonished by how beautiful it is. And it's a book like no other that you can return to again and again and again and again.
And yeah, exactly. It's a comic novel. And when he's comparing it to The Great Gatsby, one of the things that he's talking about is in terms of structure. And he goes into the whole thing with every chapter having a color and a theme and all of that. But James Joyce himself told Nabokov that he thought it was a mistake. It's irrelevant to enjoying the book because the book is comic, and everything about it is meant to make you laugh. So and one of the things I think the 2003 version gets that I don't think the 67 version does is because it's just a slick production that is trying to make this as accessible as possible. It is scraping together the best bits of the book. It does tell the story, so you are following the plot, and it actually has more of the so-called plot than the 67 version. But the 67 version really seems to hold the book in awe and in reverence. And there is no reverence because and I hate to put it this way, but in a way, the slick television people who put together the 2003 version have a better grasp, I think, on James Joyce than the people who study it in their entire life, because James Joyce did not have this kind of reverence for this material. And I can point to 100 examples, most of which, unfortunately, aren't in the film because they're literary devices. But for instance, in chapter 16, you have this narrator who is constantly making grammatical and rhetorical mistakes, and it's filled with malapropisms. And if you don't get that when you're first reading the chapter, it's fine, because eventually enough of them pile up where you realize it's deliberate, and it makes it extremely entertaining to read. And during this most recent reading that I did for this recording, I discovered something brand new and hilarious in the book that I had never discovered before. In chapter 3, when Stephen Dedalus is collecting his pay and getting a long lecture from his from the owner of the school where he teaches about how the history it's on the sort of Whiggish view of history, and how history is pointing us all toward God, and he's reciting all the times that women had caused downfall, and you and I are both fans of David Crowther's History of England
Oh yeah,
podcast, and
yeah, that's great.
I have to thank David Crowther for this, because it never occurred to me. Every historical point he makes, going back to the Norman invasion, is wrong. Everything he says is wrong. You know, at one point, he blames one person, and it's actually the flip flop. And then at the end of the chapter, as part of the kind of setup for the Bloom character, he says to Stephen, you know what? Ireland has the honor of being the only country never to have treated the Jews poorly, because we never let them in. And that's wrong too, because there is a large Jewish section of Dublin, and had been since the 1870s, and there was a lot of Jewish immigration into Ireland. And it was upon this reading I found that joke that I didn't get before, and to me that's part of that is part of the joy of our of David Crowther, and I'm going to send him this so that he knows that
Okay.
that we're that he's being talked about, because he always complains about how lonely podcasting is. And by the way, anybody listening, if you aren't listening to David Crowther's History of England podcast, if you have any interest whatsoever, Erin, I think you back me up on that. It
Absolutely.
is one of my favorites.
So good. It's really informative and really funny in a lot of ways. Not constantly, but I mean, dude's funny. His little asides are great. And then he'll mention lardy cake, and I don't even know what that is. So, sorry.
Oh,
I need to look that up.
I
might be too American to understand that.
And it is literally cake where the main ingredient is lard. It is a bun. It is a bun where the main ingredient, where you squeeze it, literally grease comes out, and then David dips it in jam, because he'll say something about slurry McDonald's or American fast food or something like that, and like this from the man who introduced lardy cake to your diet, Eric.
The one thing I got to say about that is, that leaves it open for the joke about how in Britain they eat like they're still waiting for the Luftwaffe overhead. Rationing ended a long time ago, guys.
And there's a lot of that humor in Ulysses as well, because of course one of the things that is a running joke throughout is Bloom's absolute love of the most inedible parts of a pig. Ironic, given the fact that his father was Jewish.
That is ironic.
But there's a great bit at the beginning of chapter 4 when you're entering the Leopold Bloom section of the novel, where he goes to the butcher to get a kidney, and the narrator is going through how much he loves kidneys because of the taste of piss, and it's a repeated running joke throughout whenever food comes up, and at one point he enters the restaurant and he imagines all of the patrons as animals eating at troughs, and and time again, Joyce is making fun of Irish food, Irish sausage, and because ultimately Bloom and Daedalus are two different sides of James Joyce. The mature James Joyce being Bloom, who has traveled, seen Paris, lived in Zurich, and come back to Ireland and said, "Wow, how can we eat this shit?" And it is actually paralleled in the novel and in both versions of the film, in which Joyce talks about Hamlet as being two versions of Shakespeare, with Hamlet's father, the ghost of Hamlet's father, being the mature version of Shakespeare, and Hamlet being the young version, and it makes for some real wonderful comedy. Plus, it ties it into the main theme of this, which is cuckoldry and infidelity, because the reason Bloom can't go home is because he knows his wife is cheating on him with Ulysses Boylan and doesn't want to confront her.
She bore his children, and she laid pennies on his eyes when he lay in his deathbed.
The world believes that Shakespeare made a mistake and got out of it as quickly as best he could.
A man of genius makes no mistakes. His errors become the portals of discovery.
And the reason why Daedalus thinks that Shakespeare is Hamlet's father, the ghost of Hamlet's father, is because he believes that Anne Hathaway, Shakespeare's wife, while Shakespeare was in London and she was still in Stafford, had an affair with Shakespeare's own brother.
Okay.
And so it's both structurally and plot-wise. He's constantly moving. All of this constantly moves the plot forward. It's comic, and it also ties it back into the greater theme, and it still carries it with the Odyssey parallel that he's using, because of course one of the reasons why Odysseus, or Ulysses as they say in Latin, is trying to make his way home is to keep his wife from having to commit adultery. So, it is also a clever piece of writing on a structural basis. It is also a very good story. But overall, above everything else, it is laugh out loud funny. I'll give you another example, and it's missing from the 2003 film because it's a literary trick, and the way Strick does it is actually pretty good, and it's one of the, I think, benefits of the 67 version is that he did kind of pull this thing off. It takes place in a newspaper office where Bloom works as a solicitor, and Stephen Daedalus is dropping off a letter by the owner of the school that he teaches at about hoof and mouth disease that he wants published, one of their near misses. And Bloom is canvassing for this ad that he wants to sell that to a fellow named Keys, and he gives him an offer of, he wants it run for 3 months with a renewal, and the joke of the chapter is that all of the sections have a headline, like a brief, pithy headline from a newspaper in it. And the headline for this section is KMA. And the entire section, or news story, is "Tell me you can kiss my ass." And then the next section is called KMRIA, and Bloom comes back with a counter offer, and he says, "Tell him he can kiss my Royal Irish ass." And that's that's the tone of the entire everything is a literary joke. The densest chapter on this, besides chapter 3, which I think if you've made it past the first 2 chapters and quit reading Ulysses and didn't finish the book, chances are it was at the beginning of chapter 3. And we'll get to that in a moment. But the densest chapter, I think, is the one that takes place at the hospital, where Joyce begins with a joke that the narrator is narrating in ancient Anglo-Saxon. And again, if you're reading it first, that's going to frustrate the piss out of you. Before born, they've had this, and then and the language is deliberately fruity, and it is dense, and then he moves through all the different phases of language, and you see the introduction of French words, and at one point, Malachi Mulligan, the stately plump Buck Mulligan of the opening of the novel, enters, and it becomes a gothic romance mystery, and he writes it in that form. And at the end of it, the narrator is narrating almost in by 1904 standards modern slang, and it is a great literary joke. But of course, you have to keep reading to get the joke, and then it becomes just an absolute joy to read. So on a second reading, Ulysses is filled with these, and on a whatever now 10th reading, big thanks to our good friend David Crowther, I was able to get yet another incredibly funny joke. And that to me is the joy of Ulysses. And both films, in their own way, convey it. In the Joseph Strict version, he has people wearing sandwich boards with these headlines on. And a sandwich board comes by saying KMA, and another sandwich board comes by saying KMRIA. And that was his filmic equivalent. In the 2003 version, because it is kind of a literary trick, the scene just isn't in. But again, of the two, I think if someone hasn't read the book, they're going to probably appreciate the 2003 because it is better as a film. Okay. But the 1967 version has a lot going for it. And here's where I'm going to get back into my first reading, because I think I prepared myself, not purposefully, obviously, for reading Ulysses in the perfect way. Because starting at the age of about 16, I began delving into European film. And the way I pictured Ulysses, because I had seen the films of Fellini, where Federico Fellini, the great Italian director, was very good at just changing vantage point, and the way he used his camera, you could go from one person's point of view to another, to another, to another, to another. And so I kind of pictured reading Ulysses the same way you would read a screenplay for like a silent film, with maybe somebody there narrating it for you and all the dialogue as being just the silent inner card. Now, okay. Fellini claims he never read James Joyce, which is irrelevant because, of course, by the time Fellini was making films in the 1950s and 60s, Joyce was so much in the zeitgeist, something he'd encountered but had influence. So that's irrelevant to the conversation. But what is relevant to the conversation, and this is unfortunately in a negative way, is that Joseph Strict, the director of the 1967 version, was definitely influenced by Fellini. And I'll go back to the Circe section, the kind of mad, hallucinogenic, surrealist, absurdist play in the middle of the novel. One of the problems is it almost becomes like incest, because he's using these Fellini-type camera movements on top of James Joyce already doing that on a literary basis. But then he has written them as Beckett-type absurdist sketches from, say, an Endgame. And when you get the three combined at the same time, at a certain point, no matter how highbrow you feel like your film viewing habits are, you're just like, God, that's an awful lot of pretentious, you know. And that's why it's the worst section of the film. And the second negative thing that I'm going to say about it is that the section that we began with, Penelope, 18th chapter, the yes, because Molly Bloom's soliloquy takes up the entire last half hour of the 1967 version.
Dang.
And
that's a long soliloquy.
It is in the book too, but it's percentage out of, it is a percentage of 60 some pages out of, almost 600, so it's only about 10%, but to give it a quarter of the running time. And unfortunately, this is where the very low budget of the 67 version, I think, comes in, because it is just voiceover narration, shots of Molly in her bedroom, and then this kind of montage of modern things like modern day traffic, beautifully shot. This is done in pan. Another thing I'm a sucker for are those black and white Panavision, 70 millimeter films of the 50s and 60s. I just think that's just an absolutely beautiful look. If they have the letterbox in it and it's in black and white, I'm already sold on at least watching the film. Some of these shots are incredibly beautiful, but they're just traffic in Dublin. Or every once in a while you'll have a recreation of something that Molly's talking about. Because, for instance, when we heard the Salman Rushdie that Bloom was pimping his wife to Daedalus, that's a theory. What actually is happening is Molly had overheard the two of them, has never seen Stephen Daedalus in person, doesn't know what he looks like, but is part of because of the stream of consciousness, where this is just her ranting in her mind. She briefly fantasizes about having sex with Stephen Daedalus, which who of us haven't? Like oh, that sounds interesting. Ooh, I wonder what they'd look like naked, or what have you. And it's a moment like that, which because of what I call the pink herring that James Joyce leaves, could lead you, I guess, to think that perhaps that Bloom is looking at Daedalus that way. But it is a complete and total misreading, I think, of what, and we'll get into that in a moment. But it becomes something that reading the novel never was to me, which is that last half hour. It gets tedious, it gets boring. And in the 2003 version, again, which is trying to make this much more accessible, takes all of the, I'm going to just, for lack of a better phrase, say naughty bits of Molly Bloom's soliloquy when she's talking about Bolin having a large cock, and talking about the veins in it, and talking about how many times she orgasmed, and talking about her breasts and things like that, and cuts it into a brief 4-minute opening for the film. So the film actually opens with the ending. And because it takes place over a 20-hour day, you get it. You get a cycle. So you're going to cycle back, and she is hinting at things that are going to happen. But unfortunately, because it opens with because he never did a thing like that before, and it skips the ask for breakfast in bed, except when he was laying up doing his highness for that old faggot, Mrs. Riadorn. It's making a promise that the film's never going to be able to deliver on, because you're thinking, oh well, the film's going to fill in the gap. Who was this Mrs. Riadorn? And there is an answer in the novel, but it's not in the film because you can't fit a quarter of a million words into a 2-hour film. But I like that. I like that because when you do get to it's about 8.5 minutes at the end of Molly Bloom's soliloquy, and it's not just a montage. She actually breaks the fourth wall. You are watching Molly speak, and so you are following a performance, both physically and vocally. Okay. And it makes a huge difference because, and I would sit and watch Angela Ball as Molly Bloom deliver that soliloquy for half an hour when I'm actually physically seeing her sitting on a chair delivering that, well lit and beautifully shot with great set dressing and beautiful costume. And again, that's why I say this film was kind of, I'm a sucker for these type of films because that is how those, and you used to watch them too on Mystery and Masterpiece Theater. That's how this is done. That's how you make it. It is, how do I make this accessible to some middle-class person who got home from work and is going to sit down and watch this and just want to be entertained. And I think it does a very good job of that, which I don't think the Joseph Strick version does. I don't think anybody watching the Joseph Strick version is immediately going to say, I really need to go see Ulysses. I really think it's made more for those of us, and I think it's a good film, and I think everyone should watch it. And I think even if you haven't read Ulysses, you will get a lot out of it. Okay. But I don't think anyone will watch it and say, I've got to go read Ulysses because I want to hear more about this, that, and the other thing. Whereas if I were the publisher of Ulysses, the 2003 version is the one I'd want people to see because it has all of the best bits. It has a lot more of the plot of Ulysses in it. and it is also done at a higher, slicker level of entertainment. And so those are my final thoughts. I just kind of want to get to the end of this room because I don't want this to be as long as Ulysses.
Right.
So, have I said anything to sway your mind that you might at least give one of these two films a try? And I'm not even going to touch whether or not you want to read the novel because that's a big ask. But
Yeah.
Do you have a slightly different attitude towards Ulysses that you maybe did before?
I'll try the 2003 film and see what I think of that, and if I like it, I might give the book another shot, knowing that it's supposed to be funny, but I can't guarantee that I'll enjoy it, but I will try it. I'll give you that.
That's all I ask out of this world. Oh, sex. This book is filled with so much sex.
Oh,
sex.
See,
Absolutely.
I may be too ace for this book. I'll give it a try.
Good line. Good line. Okay, let's see. This is the first book that has a female character talk about her menstrual cycle. And at one point, you have Molly actually peeing in a chamber pot, worried that her menstrual cycle is coming on, whether that's going to affect her affair with Bolin. And then she thinks to herself, "But some guys like that." And that's the kind of frankness that sets this book apart. But it's also the type of thing that got both the book and the 1967 film banned.
Again, I may be too ace for this book, but no, it's actually interesting that he put that in there. I feel like he was a bit of a pervert, and that's fine. Not to kink shame that he can do what he likes. Well, he can't anymore, but when he was alive, he could. Not gonna kink shame.
I don't think he's being a pervert because I think what he is capturing is we all have weird thoughts and we all think about weird shit.
Oh, I know that he was a pervert in real life. He's like super into farts, and that's to me that's gross on both an autistic and an asexual level. Like, I can't handle smells.
He would actually sit on the bed all day with his children and then later his grandchildren playing around him while he hand wrote these books. He lived the life of basically a monk until he died in his early 50s of an ulcer. Now,
that's unfortunate.
What he is capturing in Ulysses, though, is the bizarrity of the human mind in a pre-Freudian way. He does mention twice the so-called Vienna School, but Freud had not taken hold yet. And through stream of consciousness, for instance, Bloom is constantly checking out women's legs. At one point he is very disappointed because he waits to see a woman step up onto a tram just so that he can get a glimpse of her ankle and her stocking, and another tram comes by and he misses it. Another point, he is at a beach and a woman shows Bloom her underwear in an exhibitionist way, and he literally masturbates in his pants. And Joyce is describing this, and then the woman gets up, and it turns out that one of her legs is lame, and you have Bloom both dealing with kind of the weirdness of what he just did, and also the guilt of the fact that the woman turns out to have a handicap. But Joyce is also dealing with something that I think all men, whether they admit it or not, deal with it, which is you feel guilt just naturally after an orgasm, whether you're masturbating or during sex. And Joyce is frankly talking about how the human mind works.
It's interesting. It's an interesting way to get into somebody's mind, because I don't think that way. So seeing, getting a glimpse of how some people do think is interesting to me. Because again, neurodivergency, my brain does not work the same way as everybody else's. So it's one of the things I love about literature and theater and film is you get to see other people's perspectives and, you know, ways of thinking that never occurred to you before. And I think that's brilliant.
Well, and if every one of your thoughts were being read and put onto a page, admit it. And I think anybody listening would admit it. There'd be some, what people might say, pervy stuff. There might be some, what other people might judge as weird crap, you know, in inverted commas.
Yeah, mine definitely
would be weird. I think that's what Joyce really is trying to capture with the three assassins.
That's interesting.
But
my brain definitely does come up with weird stuff.
Well, and some of it is fetishy, you know. But what I call the pink herring. At a certain point, Buck Mulligan points to Bloom and says, "The wandering Jew," and warns Stephen that Bloom is coming for him in a sexual way. And this provides another bit of tension and plot, because when Bloom is following Stephen, ostensibly to take care of him after he sees him drunk at the hospital and then later at the brothel, you are wondering, is this a guy pursuing him for these unsavory reasons, only to find out that it's simply because he finds Stephen to be intelligent. And again, it provides quite a bit of humor throughout the book. So, thank you everyone for joining us. Next week, we're going to be doing Luis Buñuel's Simon of the Desert, a 45-minute short he made in 1965 about a real-life saint named Simon of Stylites who stood on a pillar for 34 years preaching in the 4th century. It's also, by the way, a comedy. So join us next week for that. Erin, any closing thoughts before we go?
I think what I'll say is, keep your mind open. You might like something you didn't like before.
Perfect. Thank you. And let's try that with Simon of the Desert, which, by the way, if you're listening to this on YouTube, is also on the World Cinema History channel on YouTube, the entire 45-minute film. So thank you very much, and see you all next week for Simon of the Desert. Have a great one.